Morena tātou e te whānau. I want to invite us to start with an exercise that will be easier for some than others. I want you to cast your mind back 20 years to the year 2004. George W. Bush is re-elected president of the US. The two battles of Fallujah rage. In a dorm in Harvard, a young man called Mark Zuckerberg invents a website that he calls The Facebook. The Helen Clark government is into its second year. Ben Affleck and Jennifer Lopez, after about 2 years together, have announced that they will be divorcing. Is that a little too soon? 20 years is a relatively short period of time for a community to be reflecting on, especially an intergenerational community like us. For us, when we come to a text like this, we are sitting at nearly a 2,000-year gap from the events that set in motion this story that we are a part of, the story that we call the gospel. And so over somewhere in the next decade, depending on where your scholarship lies, we will be celebrating and crossing over that period where we're marking 2,000 years since the death and resurrection of Christ. But for the Galatians, for the people who first heard these words, these things are things that have happened within a very, very short period of living memory. These are things where people can remember what life was like before that event, and where they can think about live things that have shaped their world around them within their own lifetimes. And so the whole frame of Galatians is Paul saying that there are these things that have happened that we share as the gospel, the good news of Jesus Christ, that have changed everything. And we want to lean into those things and ask the question, what is it like to live on the other side of these things? And Paul sets up the whole arc of this book, of this letter, in light of this. So he begins by saying that the grief that is driving this letter in 1:6 is that you are deserting the one who called you to live in the grace of Christ. You've moved away from this initial gospel. He says that in chapter 1, verse 9, that if anyone is preaching a gospel to you other than what you have accepted, that is what he's targeting. He talks about the gospel that he preached to the Galatians not being of human origin. He talks about his conflict with the other apostles, particularly Cephas, who he saw as not acting in line with the truth of the gospel. And he sets up, as we pivot towards chapters 5 and 6, the sense that having begun with the Spirit, now you are trying to finish by means of the flesh or the body. And so chapters 5 and 6 is sort of the landing runway of this letter, is asking us the question, what is the good life? What is the Christian lived response to this gospel, this good news, this death and resurrection of Christ looks like? And Paul characterizes that as life in the Spirit, the sense that there is this whole new category, eschatological category, this whole new way of being in the world that is now required of us because of what God has done in the gospel. And so what we're seeing in this passage and what Rebecca grabbed last week and what John will be talking about next week is a whole series of inversions where Paul is wrestling with and inviting the Galatians to wrestle with, you have to rethink the whole world, every value structure that you've had, every conviction you have had, every assumption you've had about what the human good life looks like in light of this gospel. And so we see this in the New Testament period when the Romans encounter this gospel. Those who are paying attention, both those who believe and also those who stridently don't believe, make this point that this thing that is being preached is so radically different from everything else. Tacitus calls Christianity a deadly superstition, reflecting in his mind a hatred against the human race and everything good in the world. Quite a strong claim. And Nietzsche, probably the most notorious modern commentator on this phenomenon, notices that basically what the gospel is doing in the first century is engaging with every value structure that the Greek, Roman, and arguably the Jewish frame is putting forward and inverting it in incredibly powerful ways. Nietzsche writes this in the 19th century. They, that is the Christians, gave consolation to sufferers courage to the oppressed and despairing, a staff and support to those who could not stand on their own, and enticed away from society and into monasteries and spiritual prisons. They turned all evaluations of worth on their heads. That's what they had to do to uphold their faith. They broke up strong men, infected great hopes. They brought joy and beauty under superstition, and so on and so forth. Suppose, Nietzsche writes, we could survey with the mocking and disinterested eye of an Epicurean God the strangely painful comedy of Christianity. As crude as it is refined, I believe we would find no end to our amazement and laughter. Christianity has been the most dangerous or the most disastrous sort of arrogance. Nietzsche's obviously not a fan. And Nietzsche's argument in Beyond Good and Evil and in so much of his other writings is that what Christianity does is it comes into the very heart of this strident, martial, strong pagan culture that valued the strong, that valued the intelligent, that valued the wealthy, that elevated certain kind of virtues, and it rips the heart out of us, and it says there is another way to be good. There is another way to be truly human. Look at Jesus. And Nietzsche famously contrasts Dionysius at the table, laughing, drinking, strong, surrounded by servants and slaves, with the crucified, with Jesus on the cross, surrounded by those who are killing him, and says, look at these two gods. Which would you want? Which value structure, which value set? And this sort of incredibly strong and stark vision of there is an inversion going on in Paul's telling of the Gospels that invites the Galatians to live very, very differently. So this is Paul's frame, that there is a set of changes of expectations about what the good life is that is implied by the Gospels. And because of the Galatians and who they are, they're this, as we've talked about in previous sessions, this quite mixed group of people with multiple layers of identities, multiple waves of migrations, and multiple loyalties. Loyalties to Caesar, frameworks around Greek philosophy, and obviously with the Jewish diaspora, there's this other layer of adherence to Torah and the requirements of the Jewish code. There are these different competing expectations and frames as to what the good life does. And in a great degree, what Paul is doing throughout the book of Galatians is going through and showing how the gospel inverts all of these things in different ways. You know, famously, when he looks at the two children of Abraham, or the two women of Abraham, Sarah and Hagar, and associates the enslaved one with the present city of Jerusalem and with the law, this kind of strange inversion that would have felt so abhorrent to Jewish minds at the time, and says that if you engage in this and frame this as your picture of the good life, now with what we know about what God has done in Jesus, then you are entering into a new kind of slavery. You are undoing the exodus that Abraham's family went through. And so what we've seen in this passage in in verses 16 to 26 is Paul's engagement with a much wider frame, that Greek and Roman frame. He's engaging with what is this picture of what the Greek world puts forward as the good life. And so for Greek philosophy, and so for anyone steeped in that culture, there is so much that is familiar in these verses. The Greek world had been well aware and thought very greatly in terms of this idea that to be good, the process is you have an inner wrestling, and that inner wrestling is between your appetites or your desires and your higher self. And that the whole frame of the good for philosophers and for those who follow Plato is that you live into this wrestling and let the higher self, the rational self, beat out that inner life. But there are different versions of what this looks like. And again, I don't want to make too much of the Greek here, but Paul is playing with, he's toying with us. He's got some puns in this passage around how he's framing this. The two dominant Greek schools or Greek accounts of how this happens, how this inner wrestling happens, is the peripatetic, one word for walking, following Aristotle, and the Stoic, which is the idea of the covered walkway. And the peripatetic answer is to say that the way that you do this wrestling is you look at two extremes. You look at asceticism and indulgence, And the virtuous, the good path, is to find the middle way between this. The Stoic is to say that you look at the extremes and you find some way beyond them. Both of these metaphors Paul uses. In fact, he begins the passage by saying, we walk in the Spirit, peripatetes, and he ends by saying, therefore, walk with the Spirit, using the word for Stoicism. And so he's kind of toying with us. He's suggesting that he is offering a third account. And that third account basically begins with saying that he accepts that there is inside us, there is this conflict going on, that we have these desires, these epithume in the Greek, these things that are pulling us in ways in our humanness away from the good. But what Paul is doing with this is something quite different from what the Greek philosophers are doing. He's not inviting us to try to override these desires by our own will, but he's trying to invite us to say, let the Spirit reorient these desires and draw out of us something that is far beyond these different other ways of doing it. And so, in some ways, what we're starting to see is the beginning of Christian doctrine around what is it to say that human sinfulness gets reoriented by the Spirit towards something that is truly good, that God makes something wonderful, even in our brokenness and even through some of our own distortions. And so in verses 16 to 18, you have this passage that talks about the way that the Spirit starts to now reorient our desires. And so we see the desires as not themselves intrinsically bad, but as misdirected. So it is not wrong to desire beauty. It is wrong to lust after beauty. It is not wrong to do these things, to have these desires, but they are misdirected. And then we start to see this build-up of what does this look like, and these two contrasting lists. This is one of the reasons why I didn't put slides up, because I was like, there's no way that we're going to put that first list of slides up as images. Debauchery, sexual immorality, idolatry, and so forth. ChatGPT would have had a field day. At first, these look very, very personal. They look very individual. But when you dig into them, what these are is these extreme versions of what alternative accounts of virtue look like, taken against society. So what does sexual immorality look like in this list? It's partly about the idea that you are taking your power and using it against others in inappropriate ways. And so all of the things within the list, and many people have commented on this, are not just personal sins, but they are sins that undo and repackage the way that the community works. Stepping into then the fruits of the Spirit, this contrasting list, these are personal goods, and they're goods that you would recognize in any list of Greek philosophical virtues. But Paul frames them all uniquely differently in the original. And he frames them in terms of these are the kinds of things that will build up a different kind of community, completely inverting the way that the wider culture would have thought about these things. So these, in Greek and Roman framings, are personal gifts that are for the ennobling of the self. So if you look at, for example, Plato's writings and sort of the famous symposium where you go through multiple speeches on virtue, you get the same building up. You start with self-control and you build up to love. But all of them are about the aggrandizement of the self. All of them are about the truly found self, the truly good self, is the self that is defined by love. In Paul's framing, each of these things still exists, but they are now about the building of a community, a different kind of expression of self in the world. And this is why he can reach back to the law and say, against, and that sort of slightly backwards framing, against such things there is no law. Because what Paul's pointing to is the fact that what the law was trying to do was not just reveal the sinful nature, but also reveal how impossible it was to build a community that reflects God's redemptive purposes in the world outside of the realities of Christ's coming and the giving of the Spirit. And so what Paul's pointing to is the fact that now by the Spirit, we can pursue goodness, we can pursue virtue in very, very different ways from the way that the surrounding cultures had understood it. But that the full fruits of that virtue is a new kind of flourishing community. It is a community in which the same kind of inner wrestling that the Greeks saw as absolutely necessary for pursuing the good still occurs, but now it occurs between selves as well as within selves. And so one of the defining factors of a Christian community is one in which there is a social expression of this wrestling for the good. And we see this in the contemporary commentators about who were looking at the first century and going, what defines these Christians? Larry Hurtado has pointed out that these Christians embraced a multicultural wrestling in a way that first century Greek and Roman commentators thought was absolutely mad. They seemed to delight, according to people like Tacitus and Livy and others, in expressing themselves in ways that didn't conflate diversity back into a single thing. They weren't trying to make people Roman. They were trying to leave them as Cretan and Scythian and Jewish and so forth, but still be one. They saw them as people who were trying to live out a uniquely ethical life, but one in which social distinction wasn't collapsed. These weren't sort of early communists where everything becomes this equal low bar. But they were trying to wrestle with what does it mean to have rich and poor, powerful and weak inside the same community in a truly good way, where one doesn't override the other, but indeed blesses the other, and where different blessings come together in new ways. And so what Paul is doing in this passage is arguing that there is this new way of walking, contrary to the value structures of the Greek or Roman world, that doesn't deny the basic realities that these worlds would have taken as assumptive or basic for how you pursue the good life. You are still going to have to wrestle, you are still going to have to reorient or suppress your desires in key ways and restrict them and restrain them. But now, by the Spirit, we do it together. And the outflow of it is not the self sitting on top of a heap. The outflow is now a very, very new kind of community, a community that we characterize as having life in the Spirit, who are doing this together. And that's why we end with, in verses 24 and 25, this key final picture, that what we're talking about is by crucifying the self and keeping in step with the Spirit, we have this picture of a community characterized by all of these good virtues that is living in constant participation in the core event of the gospel, constantly engaging in that death and resurrection that made this whole thing possible. And so there's 4 things that I think we want to take from this as people who, that beautiful phrase that we used in the liturgical bit at the start, people who are uniquely in all of history asking the same question that the Galatians were. In light of this gospel, how do we, in our context, live this out? What does it mean for us as a community to be a community, not just a bunch of individuals all pursuing our own ethically good paths, but a community together pursuing a common good that overflows into goodness into the wider community around us? 4 things I want to suggest. The first is that, and this is pretty obvious, I hope, but that the Christian good life is not a static vision of ethical accomplishment. We don't hit a plateau of good and go, great, we've done it. But we want to be a community where thinking and talking about the good is normal, where regular conversations with close brothers and sisters about what is good, where we're thinking about the value sets that we are holding, becomes a normal part of our conversation, where we're constantly asking questions even about our most basic patterns of meeting, of gathering. Is this good? And can we make it better? Can we find new ways to do good in the world? So the first is to say that this is certainly not a static vision of life in the Spirit. Secondly, I want to suggest that there is always going to be in the gospel an inversion of social virtues. So the classic Kiwi virtues of the beach, the batch, the boat, and the beamer. That sense of that there is a consumerist vision of the good life around us. There is a status-based vision. There is a vision of the good life that centres on individualism and autonomy versus kind of connected dependence. There are multiple other competing visions of the good life around us, and in the 21st century we probably have access to more than at any other point in history. And so we're constantly asking the question, how does the gospel require us to invert these social goods? So when you paint that picture of the good life and you say, what does it mean for me to be living well in the world in light of the gospel, and what does it mean for us? We are constantly asking that question, how is this different from the visions that are coming at us from our billboards, from our television screens, from our computers, from our social media, and so forth? And that requires the same kind of wordplay that Paul is doing with the Greek and Roman frames of good. Thirdly, I think it suggests that when we're thinking about what sin and brokenness and depravity and all of these kind of things live in our context, the Christian developed understanding of sin is incredibly important here. And it's probably, I would say, one of the biggest theological gaps in the contemporary church, if I can be honest, and one of the biggest gaps in wider Western culture at the moment, that we don't have a robust account of what sin is that allows us to recognise it in ourselves and all other persons, but wrestle with hope. We live in a kind of neo-Puritan culture, as many have pointed out, where you get cancelled in 15 seconds on social media if you tweet or post the wrong thing. We live in an achievement culture where presenting yourself in certain kinds of ways is designed to set you apart and to put you on the top of our equivalent of the social heap, much as Roman and Greek culture had worked it. We want an account of sin that allows us to recognise it in each other and in ourselves, but also to be the kind of community that, as Paul is inviting the Galatians to do, is a wrestling community. A community that is constantly asking this question, what is right orientation of desire in this circumstance? And so to recognise that the desire to be wealthy, the desire to be powerful, these things, they're not intrinsically wrong, but misoriented, they're the most distorting things in our lives. And they send us down decades of pursuit of things that, as we've heard in the last few chapters of unpacking, is a form of new slavery. These things lock us back in to the kind of slavery that the gospel will release of us. So it's not a static vision. It will always involve an inversion of social virtues. And it's the kind of account of ourselves individually and as a community that will always involve then wrestling. And so finally, I think we want to say that this leads us to a dynamic communal vision of the good life, a virtuous engagement in the community of the gospel, where we want to say that, and this is something that I think the church doesn't say enough, that the church is the social unit of the gospel. And please don't hear some sort of closet Catholicism in this, where we say, you have to be part of the church to be part of this. But really we do have to be part of a community that is expressing this in order to be living in this kind of filled life that Paul is talking about. The fruits of the Spirit, love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, gentleness, and self-control, understood properly in Paul's account, are goods that only make sense when they are ours and when they are seen to be working in relationship to each other. These are not elevated social goods where I am trying to overachieve in these things and compare my goodness to yours, compare my self-control to yours. These are things where we collectively are trying to wrestle together with what does it mean to be a community characterised by self-control, by goodness, by kindness, by gentleness, and offer together a communal account of the good to the wider society. Richard Hayes writes this when he talks about, in his moral vision in the New Testament, what the church is. Where the Spirit is poured out on the church, it sweeps the believers along as though in a great river of obedience, praise, and mighty work. Empowered by the Spirit, the community can dare and hope great things, seeing visions, dreaming dreams, turning the world upside down. Where the Spirit is at work, freedom is underway, good news to the poor, release to the captives, and so forth. The question put to us then is not, are we reforming ourselves or the world, but rather, is the power of the resurrection at work among you? The community's sharing of all its resources is the most powerful sign of the Spirit's liberating work. So I want to suggest that we could engage with many examples of what this might look like, but the question we want to be asking ourselves out of this kind of telling of the gospel is, what does this mean for us in our context? Very, very simple event has happened for the Galatians. God has arrived, God has ministered, God has lived on the world, God has died, and God has resurrected in the person of Jesus. Therefore, everything has changed. And whether it's a 20-year difference, where they're still just even beginning to get their head around this is the question, or a 2,000-year difference, where we could spend whole sermon series unpacking case study after case study after case study of what this has looked like for particular communities in particular times in particular places. I think the key takeaway I want to leave us with as Lincoln Road here in 2024, in this part of the world, with this group of people, with this cultural context, with the unique set of challenges that we're probably all very, very aware of in our context, it is, what does it mean for us to live in light of the resurrection as a community engaged in this question of what does it mean to be constantly shaped into good humans, a good community, because of this core event of the gospel. The same commands that Paul gives to the Galatians, or the same encouragements, don't change. Be crucified by the self, walk by the Spirit. But this is a wrestling that is worth our time and is the work of a church. It is the defining work of a church, that we are the community that gets to have this conversation here and now on this piece of whenua. So, let me leave us with this. May we also be the kind of community that learns to walk distinctively in the Spirit, engaging with the questions of what good looks like to all of those who live around us, our neighbours, our friends, our colleagues, and asking the question, what does it mean to be offering a distinctively good vision of this that is Christ-shaped, that is inverting the expectations of contemporary New Zealand society, offering something very, very different, but is also one that we share together, where I can look at you and you and you and know that we together hold a common set of values that we are holding each other to, just as Paul is inviting the Galatians to wrestle with us together. This is life in the Spirit, and whether a 20-year distance or 2,000-year difference, until Christ returns, this is what the people of God are called to do. So let me pray. Father, we are grateful for your word, and we're grateful for your Spirit. And animated by these things, and ultimately animated by this vision of what does it mean to follow Jesus here in our time, we ask that you, who truly sees our hearts and who is the source of all our renewal, will continue to make us into the kind of community that is engaging in this kind of wrestling, that is not leaning back into past frames, not falling back into the kind of conversation around the good that enslaves or entraps or makes us static, but consistently and regularly asking, how do we walk in the Spirit? How do we live into your story? And how do we embody the life of resurrection here in Henderson in our time? Amen.